One of these tanks was made from corrugated roofing, another was so big it collapsed bridges just by driving over them, and one never even made it to war because it melted itself trying to cross a hill. These were actual tanks, built during the Second World War, deployed by real armies, and they were hilariously, catastrophically awful. In 1940, New Zealand was worried about a Japanese invasion and didn't have any kind of homegrown armored vehicle industry. So Bob Semple, the Minister of Works, decided to improvise. The Bob Semple tank started out as a regular Caterpillar D8 crawler tractor. They just covered it with corrugated manganese steel roofing and mild steel plates for armor. Semple's team armed it with multiple Bren guns and made room for 6 to 8 men inside. In reality, this thing was a disaster from day one. The tractor chassis gave it a miserable power-to-weight ratio, barely 5 horsepower per ton. Top speed in rough terrain was maybe 5 to 6 miles per hour if you were lucky. The driver had to stop and change gears since the original transmission wasn't built for combat, and the whole tank stood over 3.5 meters tall. So not only was it easy to spot, it was unstable too. In practice, the Bob Semple looked like a rolling shed and handled about as well. The armor didn't do much, and compared to even the lightest tanks of the time, it was underprotected, slow, and awkward. The public ridiculed it right from the start. The military built maybe 3 of them in total, and none ever saw combat. The idea got dropped after attracting nothing but mockery, but Bob Semple stood by his work. He said, "I don't see anyone else coming up with any better ideas." The Soviet T35 was a perfect example of overkill in the opposite direction. Built in the 1930s, this giant machine weighed 54 tons and ran on a 580 horsepower aircraft engine. The Soviet approach was bigger is better, so they put 5 turrets on top. One main turret with a 76mm gun, flanked by 4 more turrets, each packing a 45mm gun. To operate the T-35, you needed a dozen crew members, gunners, loaders, a driver, and a commander. It was basically a land battleship. On paper, the T-35 looked intimidating, designed to fire in all directions and handle anything thrown at it. In reality, it was a nightmare to use. It moved at a crawl with a top speed of only about 8.5 miles per hour off-road. The tank was tall, easy to spot, and hard to steer. Worst of all, for all its size, the armor was actually thin, 20 to 30 millimeters, so even basic enemy guns could knock it out. Mechanical problems were non-stop. Of the 61 T-35s built, almost all were lost during the German invasion, not from enemy fire but from breaking down. The T-35 proved that more turrets and more size don't always mean a better tank. The Soviet Army learned the hard way that future tanks needed just one good gun and heavy armor, not a whole fleet of little cannons. The Japanese Type 95 was supposed to give their army a fast, mobile tank for supporting infantry and cavalry. In the 1930s, that sounded like a good idea. Japan needed a vehicle that could move quickly and had enough firepower to handle colonial wars and campaigns across Asia. The result was a light tank with a simple design, a 37mm gun, and thin armor. Good for speed, not for stand-up fights. At first, it did the job. Early on, the Type 95 held its own in places like Manchuria, but the flaws showed up fast. Its armor was so thin, heavy machine gun fire could punch through it. The 37mm gun worked on lightly armored targets. But against Allied tanks, especially British Matildas and American M3 Stuarts, it was basically useless. The tank was slow too, topping out at 28 miles per hour, and Tomi Ohara's much-hyped suspension made it prone to pitching and rough rides. Still, Japan cranked out more than 2,300 of these tanks. By the time American armor started rolling into the Pacific, the Type 95 was totally outclassed. Its gun couldn't touch U.S. tanks, and its armor didn't protect anyone. Japanese troops relying on these for cover learned fast that this tank was not up to the job. The riveted construction was a nightmare. Spalling inside the crew compartment turned the interior into a hazard. What started as a symbol of Japan's military ambition ended up as one of the most vulnerable and ineffective tanks of the war. Britain's TOG heavy tank is what happens when designers get stuck in the past. In 1939, the Ministry of Supply called up a group of First World War tank engineers, the Old Gang, hence the tank's name, to tackle the next generation of British tanks. Their solution was a massive trench-crossing machine straight out of the old playbook. The first version, TOG-1, came loaded with thick armor, a pair of sponsons for guns on either side, and a size so big it looked like a battleship on treads. The problem was, the war had changed. TOG was built for battles that no longer existed. Its complicated transmission and steering system only added to the headaches. The second prototype, TOG-2, tried to modernize things with a proper turret and other upgrades, but it was still a behemoth. Slow, hard to steer, and almost impossible to maintain in combat. The War Office took one look and passed. These tanks never made it to the battlefield. They were too cumbersome, too outdated, and proved just how far behind the curve the old gang really was by the time World War II was in full swing. At the start of World War II, the British had to basically rebuild their entire tank force. They'd invented tank warfare, but spent years arguing over the right way to do it, and when war broke out, their ideas were all over the place. The plan ended up as three main types: light recon tanks, heavy infantry tanks for direct assaults, and cruiser tanks meant to race ahead and exploit breakthroughs. The Covenanter, officially the AY-13 Mark III Cruiser Tank Mark V, was supposed to fill that last role. On paper, the Covenanter looked modern. It had big wheels, sloped armor, a low profile. It also had a 2-pounder gun that, at least in theory, could handle most tanks from 1939. The government was in such a hurry they ordered 100 before the first prototype was even finished. But by the time the first real tanks rolled out in 1941, everything had already changed. German tanks were improving fast, and the Covenanter's 30mm armor and small gun were outclassed from day one. That wasn't even the main problem. The real disaster was under the hood. The engine overheated constantly, and no amount of tinkering fixed it. They couldn't keep the thing running for more than short bursts, which made it useless for combat, especially in the desert where British armor actually needed to be. Instead, 1,771 Covenanters were built, but none ever made it to the front. All were used for home defense and mostly for training new crews. The only thing it did well was not break down if the weather was not too hot and you didn't push it too hard. Germany never invaded Britain, and the Covenanter never had to face German tanks for real. Probably for the best. If the British went too light, the Germans went to the other extreme with the Panzer VIII Maus. This was the ultimate super heavy tank, ordered by Hitler himself and designed by Ferdinand Porsche. The idea was to build something completely unstoppable, a tank so massive it could barrel through enemy lines without fear of any Allied gun. The specs are ridiculous. Nearly 200 tons, 11.9 feet tall, 12 feet wide, 33 feet long. Armor was up to 240 millimeters thick, and it had a 128 millimeter main gun that could hit targets over 2 miles away. The first prototype ran on a 20-cylinder Mercedes-Benz diesel marine engine, but it couldn't push the tank past 8 miles per hour. They built a second one with an even bigger engine, and it still barely crawled up to 12 miles per hour. But size killed the Maus before it could ever fight. It was too heavy to transport by rail, and if it tried to cross anything smaller than a major bridge, the whole structure collapsed under the weight. Mechanical problems never got solved, and the thing was a nightmare to work on. Hitler wanted 150 built, but by 1944, German industry was in disarray and only 2 prototypes were finished. When the Soviets closed in, both were damaged, and the Soviets combined the pieces into a single working Maus for the museum in Russia, where it sits today. The Maus never fired a shot in battle. It was and still is the heaviest tank ever built, but also one of the least practical.